Started. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. I'm very, very happy and excited to be introducing Professor Dilip Soman to you. Dilip Soman is the Canada Research Chair in Behavioral Science and Economics and is the Director of the Behavioral Economics and Action Research Center at Rotman at the University of Toronto. His research is in the area of behavioral science and its application to individual well-being, including financial well-being, health, wellness, policy, welfare programs, and business, customer experience, and pricing. I can tell you that as a PhD student and as a professor, I have read a lot of his work on sunk costs and endowment and the impact on pricing, and he's done some really exciting work, well thought through work in those areas. And many of those articles one uses in the PhD seminars that one has in behavioral science. Professor Soman is also the author or editor of several books, including The Last Mile, and he teaches a massive online course called B101X, Behavioral Economics in Action on edX. He has a degree in engineering. His MBA is actually from IIMA Ahmedabad, so we're very happy to have an alumni who's willing to share some of his time with us. And his PhD is in behavioral science and marketing from the University of Chicago. He serves on the advisory and research boards of Impact Canada, Privy Council Office, the Financial Consumer Agency of Edge of Canada, and he has previously taught in USA and Hong Kong. So very welcome, Dilip, to you. Thank you for taking the time. We look forward to your sharing your insights on research and behavioral science action that you have been doing in the recent past. So if I can request you to share your insights for maybe about 45-50 minutes, and then we'll have some Q&A, and then we will start the panel discussion where we'll be joined by Fatima. Thank you so much. Over to you.
Arvind Saab, thank you. That was a very kind introduction. And as you said, it's always fantastic to be back at IIMA. It's obviously, I would have loved for this to be in person, but the world is what it is. 1992, that's when I finished. So gosh, it's almost 30 years now. And some of my friends tell me that the fact that I went on to get a PhD has something to do with the fact that I was in DOM 16, which was the fellows program DOM. So maybe that had something to do with it. But anyway, it's really nice to be back virtually on campus to talk a little bit about what I've learned about the world of behavioral science as it applies to practice. So I'm going to try and share a screen here and we'll jump into it. I thought rather than speaking about any one project in particular, I was going to do the following. I'm going to think about where the field of applied behavioral science has come so far, and then thinking through what the challenges are going forward. And I'm going to try and illustrate my points with as many examples as I can possibly fit in into the next 45 minutes or so. So I'll start off with two sets of claims that I want to make about the field itself, about the applied part of the field. I'll spend a little bit of time looking back, thinking about the early successes, what we've achieved so far as a field. I'll spend the bulk of the time looking forward. I'll articulate 3 or 4 challenges that I believe that we need to work through. And I'll end with some propositions, not so much about the use itself, but about the way in which we can make our research more applicable, more valuable to practice. So that's my general agenda. And I'll start right at the beginning by acknowledging that a lot of what I'm going to speak about comes from one of my 3 books. The Last Mile, I'll spend a little bit of time at the beginning talking about some central ideas from there. I'll make some references to the Behaviorally Informed Organization. That's a book which talks about what organizations need to do differently to better use and harness behavioral science. And then a forthcoming book called Behavioral Science in the Wild, which talks about the process of taking academic research, the research that all of us do in our labs, in our institutes, and try and apply it in practice. What could go wrong? What are the challenges and how we can overcome them? So that's the general spectrum of the things that I'm going to cover. So let me start off with my first set of claims. I suspect my claims are going to be fairly uncontroversial to everybody in this room. And the first set of claim is that everybody is in the business of behavior change. And I'm going to go so far as to say that if you're not in the business of behavior change, you're probably not doing something very important. Right now, let me illustrate that by what I mean. So you could pick any profession. You could pick a doctor, you could pick a dietitian, you could pick a professor, you could obviously pick people in marketing or sales or finance. They're all trying to change somebody's behavior. And I think about behavior change challenges in four different categories. I'm going to call them compliance, switching, consumption, and acceleration. And let me just illustrate what I mean by each one of those. I think it's handy to organize our behavior change challenges along these four lines, simply because the way in which we start tackling them is going to be different as a function of where they belong. And again, I write a lot about this in the last mile. But let's start with compliance, right? It sounds like a very technical term. It sounds like the kinds of things that organizations have to worry about when they have to comply with the law. But you could think about compliance much more broadly. Like somebody sets out a set of expectations, you need to follow them. So be it your children having to comply with the rules of the house, or companies having to comply with the law and file paperwork on time, or citizens having to pay taxes on time, there's a large range of compliance problems that we need to worry about. The other one, switching or purchasing, that's something that many of us are familiar with. The idea that if you are in the market, you want people to buy your product as opposed to the competitor's product. They want you to endorse your product and share your product and create positive word of mouth. And so it's oftentimes we think about this notion of getting people to purchase as an independent decision, but in general, purchasing comes at the expense of something else. So we always think about those as switching. Stop buying something else, start buying my product. But it doesn't have to be just product purchasing. So think about the dietitian example I spoke about. Dietitian wants me to substitute certain kinds of foods with certain other kinds of food. So cut out red meat, substitute that with fruits and vegetables. Activities, your trainer might want you to stop doing some kinds of physical activities and substitute those with others. And so I guess the point I'm trying to make is that there's a broad range of categories that fall under the switching category, where you have to get people to stop doing something and start doing something else. The third category is the category of consumption. This might sound counterintuitive, like why are we thinking of consumption as a behavior change problem? But it turns out it is an important behavior change problem in many, many domains. So let me give you two quick examples. Been doing a fair bit of work in the area of online privacy. And of course, those of you who are in that area know that the standard instrument that policy advocates use or privacy advocates use is the instrument of disclosure of information, right? So there's a privacy policy, and if I get you to read the policy, if I send you information, the idea is that people will be better informed. This is true in many other domains. Think about finance, where you have to disclose properties of a product, of a financial product, so that people make the right choice. We now know that people aren't good at consuming information, right? So we've had now lots of decades of research showing that the more information you give people, the less likely they are to actually use any of it, because it is a lot, it's overwhelming, and as a result, they end up not using information at all. And so consumption turns out to be a massive problem when it comes to thinking through what behavior change challenges that we end up facing. And then finally, I talk about acceleration, the idea that all of us know what is good for us. That I've yet to meet a person who has told me that I don't want to save money for retirement, or I want to, I do not want to lead a healthy lifestyle, or I don't want to overwork. Like, everybody wants to do the right thing, but they'll do it tomorrow. And I mean tomorrow, not literally, but metaphorically. And so how do we get people to contribute to the retirement funds before it's too late? Or how do we get people to think through, eating a healthier diet before it's too late, and so on and so forth? So, so those are the four broad classes. The one other example I just want to quickly toss out in the domain of consumption, it's a problem that I think is particularly a challenge here in Canada, and I know in India as well, because I've been doing some work there, is adherence to medication regimes, right? So like every good South Asian, I have cholesterol problems and I'm prescribed statins. And it turns out that the problem with a statin, like a Lipitor or whatever else, is that any one tablet of that statin doesn't make me feel any different. Right? And you can think about this as applying to a broad range of medications, diabetes medications, birth control. It's not like Tylenol. It's not like Panadol. You got a headache, you take the medication and you feel better immediately. There's quick feedback. With cholesterol medication, it's not like that. And so under those circumstances, it is really easy for people to stop taking the medication. So one big class of problem relates to how do we keep people on track with their medication regime. So I think it's sort of fairly uncontroversial to say that everybody is somehow in the business of changing behavior. I also would say that we're not very good at it as organizations. And we're not very good at it because I think it involves dealing with people. We have this belief that people are unpredictable, that they sometimes do things that we don't expect them to do. And in a way, that's sort of where this science of behavior change really comes in. So let me illustrate why I think this challenge happens by using language that was first made popular by Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein in their 2008 book called Nudge. And the book did a lot of things, and I'm going to get to that in just a minute, but it made a distinction between two entities. There's econs. Who are econs? I remember sitting in IIMA through many classes taught by Professor Dholakia and many others on utility and the concept of utility maximization. And of course, the idea of utility maximization is very elegant. So for example, let's think about the life cycle hypothesis of saving and spending. It's a very elegant model that tells us how people should make decisions about how much to save for retirement. It's an important problem that all of us will face. It basically says, if you really want to think about how much to save, think about all of your future income streams, think about all of your future expense streams, and then set aside enough such that the net present value of the left-hand side equals to the net present value of the right-hand side, QED. It turns out that that's very elegant. You can write this out in 2 or 3 equations. I just don't know too many people that can do this, right? And there are many reasons why they can't do it. So for example, needing to know the future is itself a challenge. Like I need to know what my future income streams are going to look like. For that, I'm going to need to know what salary raises will look like. Then I'm going to need to know what my consumption patterns are going to look like for the rest of my life. How many children will I have? What are their expenses going to be? What's inflation going to look like for the rest of my life, et cetera, housing prices. And even if I had all that information, I would then need to put it into this complex net present value calculator with potentially dynamic interest rates. And I just don't think people can do that. Right? So we're going to call these people that behave like this, people that maximize utility in making any choice, as econs. Right? So who are econs? Econs they're basically fictitious creatures. They live on the pages of economics textbooks, but that's pretty much the only place you can find them. They are infinitely forward-looking. They think about the future. They have a lot of computational abilities. They can calculate net present values. They can, avoid emotion. They're not swayed by emotion. They are focused on maximizing this thing called utility, and they have a lot of self-control. But it turns out most people are not like that. Right? So here's a picture that actually shows real people. And these are people that are taking an escalator to go to the gym. Now you can say, why are they doing that? And obviously, I don't know in what context this photograph was taken, but it does illustrate a few interesting properties about human behavior. So I can offer to you 3 stories as to why these people are taking an escalator to go to the gym. Story number 1 is the economic story, right? It says that these people expect to spend a lot of energy in the gym as they're working out. So they're saving it now. They're saving energy now. So this is your classic intertemporal resource allocation kind of an economics model. It's plausible. I just suspect that's not what's going on. Okay, there's a second story. And that second story has to do with the fact that perhaps the person in the dark blue shirt, the one that's lower in the escalator, saw the person in the light blue shirt take the escalator, and so they did the same thing. Now, that sounds like a very trivial story, a very trivial explanation, but it turns out it explains a lot of human behavior. Right. So a lot of my research, as well as research done by many other people, shows that human beings do what other people do without even knowing what those other people are doing and why they're doing what they're doing. Right. So essentially giving people information about what other people do is a powerful motivator, because oftentimes people like to conform with what's happening. And we see this in the business world, right? Like, so for example, why are Amazon.com or Flipkart top 10 lists so influential? They're really influential because being in the top 10 list actually makes a difference to how well your book sells. Why? Because people are using the top 10 list as a surrogate for what other people are doing. So here's a book that's in the top 10 list. If everybody's reading it, I should do the same. Right? Now, it turns out you can actually try a bunch of experiments to help people or to use this idea in order to help people make better decisions. So in one particular experiment, we are working with a financial services organization, trying to get them to build better portfolios for retirement, for individual decision making. And it turns out, this is a very difficult thing for most people. Like there's a segment of people who will just stay away and say, I don't understand this. There's a segment who will completely outsource to your wealth manager, your advisor. And then there's a large segment of people who think they know how to do this, but really don't. And that was the segment we were focused on, right? And we said, how do I get these people to even start the process of opening an account and thinking about a portfolio? And we worked with this idea, the idea that people do what other people like them do, by giving them information about people in their stage of life. And we say, well, people in your stage of life typically have this portfolio. And that encouraged them to use that particular reference as a starting point. And then, of course, they learned over time what to do, right? Another example of this is actually from about 10 years ago. This was done by the UK Behavioral Insights team, the so-called nudge unit, when they were trying to get small businesses to pay taxes on time. And the way they did it is, this was obviously in UK. The UK, by the way, has tax forms and letters that are even more complicated than Indian forms and letters. So if you can imagine how complex that is. And the letters that they send are written in the Queen's English. And so they're absolutely impossible to even understand. So Her Majesty's Revenue Service would send out all these letters to people that were in danger of filing taxes late. And it would basically say, please pay your taxes on time. Obviously, it didn't say that. It was a 4-page letter in complex English. And so the nudge unit started adding messages at the top of the letter. And the messages would say something like, 80% of people or of small businesses in the UK pay their taxes on time, won't you? Right? Now, it turns out just telling small businesses that other small businesses are paying by the deadline increase the likelihood that they would also pay by the deadline. The messages became slightly sharper and sharper over time. So over time, they said, well, now 80% of small businesses in your community, in your county, pay businesses on time. More businesses pay on time, right? And so the idea is very simple. Telling people what other people are doing, in particular, if that other people, those other people is a large majority, increases the likelihood that they will do the same thing, right? And then back to the story of the photograph of the people taking the escalator to go to the gym. My guess is there is a third, even more simple explanation, which is that I don't think these people were thinking at all. Right. So I don't think this person in the blue shirt was standing at the bottom and saying, well, should I take the stairs or should I take the escalator? They probably came from the right-hand side of this photograph. The escalator was the first thing there, so they stepped on it. And it's an important illustration of the fact that architecture matters, right? And in this case, this is actual architecture. The people tend to do the first thing. You'll see how people tend to always take the first lift in an office lift lobby. They'll wait for the first one. But architecture matters. And likewise, choice architecture matters, which is the idea in which you present the choice is going to change the way in which people make the choice. So I'll get to that in a minute. But on this, one of the most popular notions in the field of behavioral science, or as it is applied to economics, behavioral economics, is the notion of people making decisions by default. So what's a default? It's something in the environment that makes you choose something without actively making a choice. Okay, so for example, organ donation, right? If you want to get people to donate organs, you can either have an opt-in system or an opt-out system. An opt-in system, the citizens has to fill up a form saying, I would like to donate my organs after my death. In an opt-out system, the citizen is assumed to donate their organs after death, but they have to sign a form if they do not want to donate the organs after death. Or think about buying a computer online. Right. In one case, you give people the very basic computer model and you allow them the option of adding features to it. I want a larger screen. I want more processing power. I want a better peripheral. Or you can give them the fully loaded version as a default and ask them to take things away. So they can say, I don't want a large screen and I don't want fancy peripherals, right? And it turns out that if you give people the higher value default, they are more likely to spend a higher amount on the computer. Why? Because they go with the default, right? And so it turns out that defaults play a huge role in human decision making. So let's quickly sum this up, right? Humans are different from econs. Unlike econs, humans are they're tempted by short-term things. They don't look too far in the future. Too much information confuses them. Don't give them too many choices. They're emotional, etc., etc. Now, here's the problem, right? Is I think that all of us, and we've all been guilty of doing this at some level or the other, be it in business, in academia, and anywhere else, is we tend to design things for econs when in fact our target market will be motivated to do what we want them to do. We believe that if we give them information, they will consume it. We believe that they want choices, so we give them more choices. And it turns out that that doesn't work quite well. And so I guess the point I want to make is we have to understand that it is important to design for humans and not for econs. What does that mean? It means we have to assume that they will not be motivated to buy your product to the same extent that you think they should be motivated. They will forget to do things. They will get confused by information, right? And we have to build all of this into our designs, because if we don't, then we're going to be forever stuck in this loop where we have what I call the illusion of innovation, which is we think we have this brand new innovation, we have this brand new product, this brand new idea, which everybody should be consuming, but it turns out people don't consume. And that's what I call the last mile problem, right? So that's one set of claims. Let me just quickly go to my second set, and then I'll start my sort of looking forward, looking backward piece. So second set of claims is, I think there's a huge gap between the need for behavioral science and its actual use in organizations. Right? So, I mean, as you think about our field, and if you subscribe to the notion that almost everything we do has to do with behavior change, you should be seeing the science used everywhere in organizations. It's not. Right? And so the question is, why is that? And it's my belief that we have a beautiful science, but we don't have a science of using that science. Right? In the field of medicine, for example, they have something called an implementation science, which is, let me take a result from the lab, let me translate that meaningfully, let me create practice guidelines for practitioners. We don't have that. And so part of what I've been working on with many collaborators is to try and see if we can develop the analog of implementation science in the field of behavioral science. Okay, so very quickly looking back, choice architecture, briefly mentioned what it is. Changing the context changes the outcomes. So can we create a context in which we can steer people towards the kind of outcomes that we want, right? Now, again, we've spoken a little bit about defaults. In one particular project that I was involved in, we were trying to get people to get an annual health checkup, right? This was an insurance company. The company sold an insurance product, which, like any other product, entitled you to drug prescription plans and an annual health checkup. So people that had bought this product had actually prepaid to get an annual health checkup. Now, it turns out only 17%, 17% of those people actually went and got their checkup, right? And so the company was concerned for various reasons. They commissioned a market research firm. The market research firm did the usual stuff. They called up the 83% and said, why didn't you get a checkup? And most people said basically many versions of the same thing. They said we were too busy, right? Now I don't believe that. So when you think about a doctor's checkup, right, you're probably in the doctor's office for like 45 minutes, 1 hour. Maybe you live far away, so 1 hour to get there, 1 hour to go back. Maybe there's a test involved, another hour, 4, 5, 6 hours, right? Who doesn't have 6 hours in a complete year to make sure that their health is okay, right? And so we tried to kind of figure through what went on. We did a lot of behavioral diagnosis. We learned a few things. And so the next year in which the company was doing this, they did something different. They actually randomly assigned people an appointment, right? So they would actually say, you know, Professor Arvind, thank you for buying the product. And as you know, our product entitles you to an annual checkup. I've booked you to see Dr. Sinha with an address and everything on June the 10th at 10 a.m. Should you not be able to go, please call to reschedule. Right? Now, it turns out under those circumstances, about 67% of people got their health checkup. Okay, that's a huge jump. It's a huge jump by simply randomly, and this is random, by the way, right? So it's not like we systematically came up with some science as to what to assign as an appointment. We just randomly assign people, but having an appointment in your calendar made it more likely that you would stick to it. The friction wasn't that people were busy, they just didn't want to phone, right? And so sometimes it's the little stuff in the environment that actually trips people up. It's not the big stuff, right? And this is the one thing that I often say to all of my colleagues. We encourage our students, our practitioners, our executives to think big, think about the big ideas. But I also say there's the little stuff that trips people up. When it comes to human behavior, it's not the big stuff, it's the little stuff, right? Lots of other examples, right? Information presentation. You can take the same information, let's say on pricing. We talked about pricing a little bit earlier. Think about the following. Let's imagine you are a company that's trying to sell an energy efficient appliance. So in Canada, maybe that's a furnace, which is keeping my house warm right now. It's an air conditioner or whatever else. And it essentially means people have to upgrade. So they have to get rid of their old device, replace it with a new device, right? And let's imagine you've done all of the calculations on consumption patterns and all of that stuff, and you come to the conclusion that if people use your device instead of what they're using right now, then they would save, I don't know, 1,000 rupees or 500 rupees or 100 rupees every month on their bills, electricity bills, right? Now, you could present that information one of two ways, right? You could go to people and say, if you upgrade your appliance, you will save 100 rupees every month, all right? Or you could tell them, if you fail to upgrade your appliance, you will lose 100 rupees every month, right? It's the same information presented differently. And as you've probably guessed, telling them that, using the failure story increases the likelihood that people will actually upgrade. And we've actually done that. So this is not just sort of a theoretical thing. We've done a project in which we actually showed that upgrading appliances or presenting information as a potential loss, right? And you can do this in other domains. So my colleague Tanjim Hussain did an interesting experiment along with John List and a few other collaborators in a factory where, we think about productivity bonuses, right? People are given a target for a given day. They're producing, 20 units. But if they manage to produce 30 units, then they get the extra 100 rupees as a productivity bonus, or, whatever that amount is, let's say 1,000 rupees. You can present that information again in these two different ways. So you can say, if you produce the extra 10 units, then I will give you the extra 1,000. Or you can say, you can promise people the extra 1,000, and you say, if you fail to produce the extra, then I will deduct the 1,000, right? And Tanjim and John and his colleagues showed that, in fact, when workers see the information presented as a potential loss, they actually work harder, right? So this is not just about sales. It applies in many different domains of life. So I can give you lots of sort of examples of early successes where people have tweaked a message or changed a form or changed a process, and people are suddenly doing things differently. Now, I'll just give you one more example here because I think it's relevant given the times that we live in, and that has to do with getting vaccinations, right? So this was actually done before COVID. This was done with flu vaccinations, which is a big thing in this part of the world. And if every October in Canada, for example, when the flu season is around, we're all encouraged to take flu vaccinations. And you'll see signs all over the place. You'll see signs saying flu season is here, come to, go to your local pharmacy or whatever. And many companies have employee wellness programs where they organize flu vaccination clinics in the premises, right? So if you work for one such company, you would get an email in October saying the usual, flu season is here, get your free flu shot anytime next week in the atrium of the main building. Now, the one thing I've learned, and many of you will agree with me, is that when you want to get people to do anything, right, telling them that they could do it anytime is perhaps the worst thing you could do. Right? Why they never do it? They procrastinate, right? And so we did an experiment to try and replicate a previously published paper by a bunch of colleagues at Dartmouth College. And in that experiment, we changed the email slightly. The subject line, we added a question. We said, will you get your free flu vaccination next week? Question mark. Right? Same information as the original email. And at the end, there was a rhetoric question. Will you think about it? Will you get your free flu vaccination next week? Yes or no? You didn't have to answer. You didn't have to respond to anybody, but it was just left there as a question. And it turns out, so originally about 47% of employees were getting their vaccination, right? By making it a question, by changing the subject line and by adding that sentence at the end, we pushed that up to 62%. Okay, so just a small tweak in the email, right? There was a third condition. And in the third condition, we had the same question in the subject line, will you get your free vaccination next week? Same information, but instead of yes or no, it said yes, because I care about my health and the health of my collaborators, my co-workers and family, versus no, I don't care, right? 82% in that condition got their vaccination, right? So notice what we've done, right? We've not changed incentives. We've actually not changed the information significantly. We've just changed the way in which it was presented. Now, why does this happen? When you put a subject line, when you put a question in the subject line, people are now reading that information with a view to answering the question. Right? Previously, it was just information. And you know what happens to information? It's always put on the back burner, right? I will think about it later. So simple change had a fairly significant effect on people's flu vaccination rates, right? So a lot of early successes, lots, okay? But here's a map that the OECD puts out. This is the most recent version of the map. It talks about the fact that different government units all over the world, there's about 202 right now, or quasi-government units are using behavioral insights all across the world. Since this map came out, of course, there was the Niti Aayog and stuff that's happening in India as well. But there's a lot. So clearly there's been a lot of activity, right? I just want to quickly put this out. 4 different ways of changing behavior, in my opinion. Restrictions, which is you ban something. If you want to get people to choose between A and B, simply make B unavailable. People will have to choose A. You can do this if you're a government. You could also do this if you were, I don't know, Apple, right? So when the new iPhone comes out, the old version becomes incredibly hard to use. The cord doesn't fit. The speed becomes slow. Any way in which you can make one option harder to access is an example of a restriction, right? Information persuasion. Okay, this is what we learn in all of our courses, right? Persuade people. Think about advertising, give them information. We know that works. quite well. The problem with information alone is too much information is never good. Right? Incentives, discounts, free gift, coupons, or punishment. Governments can use subsidies or taxes, right? Again, the literature is quite clear on this now. The emerging consensus is that incentives are fantastic in the short run, but they don't do well in the long run, right? So one of the most famous findings in marketing, for example, is the so-called post-promotion dip, right? Which is when you put a particular product on sale, it sells massively high volumes compared to the usual baseline level. But after you withdraw the promotion, then there's a dip. People buy less of it. Why? They're simply stockpiling the product, right? So incentives work well to change when people buy the product, but they don't really sort of, change longer term behavior. And then finally, choice architecture, right? The stuff we spoke about, presenting choices differently, right? I will say this about choice architecture, and I didn't think about this till I actually actively started doing research in this area. But everything around us is choice architecture. All of our choices are made in a context, right? We never really think about the context. And I think as choice architects, we need to start thinking about this a little bit more, right? In what sequence are items presented on a shopping website? Are they presented sequentially or simultaneously? All of these things matter, right? And they matter in a scientific, behaviorally informed way. And therefore, we must make sure that we have behavioral scientists on the team who can advise us on little things like website design, or how does your form look like, or what brochure. Oftentimes, these decisions are made by people who don't know behavioral science. Right. And so I would make the argument that a lot of the success or failure of our products is in the hands of these things: the website designer, the merchandiser, the graphic artist, the people that design forms and leaflets, and we almost surrender to them to determine the success and failure of a product. So I think we just need to be a lot more hands-on, a lot more behaviorally informed about these little things, so I think that's an important point to keep in mind. Mind you, I present these 4 options not because I believe any one of them is better than the other, but I think we need to use all 4 depending on the situation, depending on the context, right? So, for example, in our project with retirement savings, and actually savings in India, in rural India, we said, let's start with incentives. We incentivize people by just giving them a free gift or matching or whatever else to open bank accounts, right? Once they've got bank accounts, we use choice architecture. People like you do this, right, to get them started on savings. Then we give them information as they become more and more comfortable over time. We give them information about how to manage portfolios. And so over time, you could use these in different combinations to achieve whatever behavior change you want. Okay, I have about 7 or 8 minutes. I'm going to speak about the road ahead. Okay. Lots of early successes. We've had massive success with pilots. We've shown great use cases. I think there's 4 things we need to worry about. I'm going to sort of quickly talk about each one of them. Ethics. As behavioral science becomes more of an applied field, we need to worry about the ethicality of the work that we do as an applied field. Sludge. What is sludge? Think about sludge as the evil cousin of nudge. Nudging makes it easy for people to do things. Sludging makes it difficult. We need to worry about that. Then there are 2 big ones, translation and scaling. I think, like I said, lots of success with pilots, not as much success with translating that into organizations and scaling interventions, and then organizational issues at all. So I'm going to quickly focus on the first 2. I'll spend a little time on the third, and then we leave the fourth for another venue, because we simply won't have time to get there. So ethics, right? Important thing to keep in mind is that there can be no choice architecture condition, right? So when you're writing ethical guidelines for advertising or promotion, right, you can imagine a world without advertising and without promotion. There is no world without choice architecture. There is always choice architecture. Now, the question is, who determines what the choice architecture is. It makes the process of ethics difficult, right? Is we can't write ethical guidelines just like the advertising people do, because our sort of ambit is slightly different. So one important question is, who decides what the desired behavior change should be? If I'm nudging you to do something, in whose interest am I doing it, right? So I always think that, we know that there's a massive action intention gap. We know people want to save more money than they save. We know people want to spend more time with their families than they do. We know they want to eat healthier diets. Start with those domains where people express the desire to do something that they can't do. To me, are good, easy, unethical, unethics-free domains for behavioral interventions, right? If people want to save more and your nudging or whatever choice intervention helps them save more, no ethical questions as far as I'm concerned. So that's one way to think about it. The other way to think about it is increase individual welfare versus increase firm welfare. So let me actually show you a quick plot here. Okay? So think about an intervention where, let's imagine you're trying to get people to buy or to make better decisions with credit cards. This is actually based on a project that one of our partners, the Commonwealth Bank of Australia, did. When you buy credit cards or when you look at credit cards online, the website will give you lots of information about what's good about this credit card. It will not tell you why you shouldn't buy the credit card, right? So the bank said, well, let's try transparency. Let's be honest, right? And so they had a project where they said, here's a bunch of credit cards. It's great for you if you follow this profile, but it's not a good card for you if you are, this other profile, right? So they did that, and they essentially discovered, I'm going to cut a nuanced story and make it crudely simple. They essentially discovered that acquisitions went down. So there were less new credit card acquisitions in a given period. But the existing users and whatever acquisitions they got stayed longer with the bank. They bought other products. They charged more to the card, et cetera, et cetera. Okay? So it's your classic sort of lower acquisition, but higher lifetime value of the customer idea, right? That was an example of something that was what I call in this chart an easy win. Right? Stakeholder welfare went up. People made better choices. They were happier with their cards. They were confident enough to use it. And obviously the organizational, the bank benefited, right? They eventually ended up making more profit. There was a short-term loss, right? But then there's a world in which you can imagine that the bank confused their customers into buying things that they didn't really need. Customer welfare went down, but the bank welfare went up. That would be an ethically wrong situation. That's the orange box over here, right? That's one where we need to clearly avoid, right? There could be other situations. There could be a situation in which the stakeholder, the customer welfare goes up, but the bank welfare goes down, right? Now, you could think about that as a charitable thing. I'm helping my customers at my own expense. It could be potentially strategic. You could say, I want to build customer loyalty. So that could be sort of a loyalty building kind of mechanism where you're willingly giving up profits in order to improve customer welfare. And of course, the red zone you want to stay away from. Like, it benefits neither the customer nor the firm. So that's a handy way of thinking about how we should make decisions about where to intervene and where not. If we do an experiment and we find out that you land in the green box, let's do it. If it's in the orange box, let's avoid it. If it's in the blue box, let's think about ways in which perhaps we can monetize this innovation better. If it's in the red box, nobody's winning. So again, steer clear. Okay, sludge, right? I fell into something called a subscription trap recently. I was buying something on Amazon. Amazon has an affiliate program where you can end up buying a product that they recommend along with the product that you wanted. So there was a pre-ticked box somewhere. And I ended up subscribing to a newspaper that I didn't really want to read. And I didn't even know this had happened till the newspaper started showing up at my house. This has probably happened to many of you. You end up buying things that you don't want to do, right? Because somebody has cleverly designed a web page. So that's a subscription trap. Like, you end up getting things that you don't really want. But the more interesting thing for me was when I tried to cancel the subscription, right? which is the process to cancel the subscription was so complex that I almost didn't do it. Right? It involved several phone calls and letters and filling up forms. And that's an example of what I call sludge, or what many other people call sludge. So you could think about sludge as frictions that prevent your customer, that prevent your stakeholder, be it an employee, whoever else, from doing what they want to do. Right? You can have all kinds of friction, clunky processes. Right? Sometimes our processes are so complex that people don't want to do it. Okay, or information is complex that people don't understand what to do. Right? But there's a third thing that we don't think about too much. It's an emotional spotlight. Right? So one very interesting thing that I learned in India, for example, is India had a lot of great agricultural subsidy programs or poverty subsidy programs. And I'm talking about like the 1990s. I'm not quite sure what's going on now. But a lot of people didn't take those up. Right? And the reason they didn't take those up is getting the subsidy involved going to the local state bank and waiting in line. And everybody in the village would then know that you were getting assistance from the government. Now, we've seen this in India. We've seen this in other parts of the world. We've seen this in Brazil with the Bolsa Familia program. You put the emotional spotlight on the recipient of welfare, and that becomes a friction for them. Right? So people weren't taking money that they were entitled to because now everybody would know that they were getting welfare. When we shifted in both Brazil and India to electronic and therefore invisible ways of payment, with India with Aadhaar and linking bank accounts, and in Brazil with prepaid cards, take-up rates went up. Right? Now people were very happy to accept the welfare. They needed the welfare, but now others around them didn't need to know that they were getting welfare. Right? And so oftentimes that's a big source of friction that we don't think about too much. Our processes put an emotional spotlight, and in many cases a negative emotional spotlight that prevents people from doing it. Now, mind you, not all friction is bad. Okay, so I'm not going to say we should make everything easy. Okay, and you'll ask me, Dilip, what's an example of something that should have friction, right? Here's one: divorce. Okay, so let's and this is divorce not just in a personal sense, but also let's say in a professional sense. Let's imagine you and your business partner have a fight, right? You do not want a one-click button to get divorced from them. Right? Why? Because it's the heat of the moment. Something has happened. You're angry. And if you make it easy for people to get divorced, then the world would not be as happy a place, right? So there are some processes where we want friction, right? Contract negotiation, okay? We need a cooling off period. Labor negotiations, we need a cooling off period. Why? Because sometimes in the heat of negotiating, people end up committing to things that they later on wake up next morning and say, no, I didn't want to do that, right? So friction isn't always bad. Sometimes it can be good. Consumption, when people are over consuming, it is actually good to give some friction, right? So imagine the following thought experiment in which you give people a large bag of potato chips or whatever else. They eat it, right? They eat it because there's no friction in eating. Okay? You can just keep going on and on. But if you take the same quantity of potato chips and you break them into, like, I don't know, 6 different bags, now at the end of every small bag, people have to make an active decision. Should I open the next bag, right? And that trigger is enough in many cases for people to realize, no, I probably shouldn't be eating more, right? So that's an example where friction helps. We call that a decision point idea. So let me maybe just end with this plot, and then we'll probably leave translation and scaling for questions or discussion in the panel later on. Here's a simple framework for thinking about friction and whether it helps or hurts consumers, right? So on the columns, does it facilitate decision making? Are you reducing friction? Or does it impede decision making? Are you adding friction? And then on the rows, does it help consumers or does it harm consumers? So think about box number 1, right? Making things easy to help people. That's what Taylor and Sunstein wrote about in Nudge. But then you go down and you say, can you make things too easy to harm consumers? There's a huge set of literature on something called dark patterns online, right? How websites can systematically misguide people, knowing that they're human and knowing that people aren't going to spend the time to read every sentence carefully. So my subscription trap example is a classic example of a dark pattern or nudge for bad, right? It's reducing friction, but harming consumer welfare. How about box number 3? You impede decision-making, you increase friction, but it helps people. We spoke about that. Decision points or cooling off periods, things that prompt vigilance. And then finally, at the bottom right, sludge, right? Friction that harms people. Okay, now I will say this last thing about sludge, and then I will actually hand it back to Professor Sahai. Sludge is like weeds in your garden, right? Weeds just come up. Nobody plants them there. So what I'm trying to say is oftentimes organizations don't deliberately try and make it hard for customers, right? Like I know so many CEOs who will basically, once they recognize the fact that there's sludge in the system, they're shocked at it, right? But it's not that they're trying hard, it just builds up, right? Years and years of not looking at your process will allow sludge to build up in the systems. And so that's the one thing that I think we really, really need to worry about, is to make sure our processes are appropriately easy for our customers and our stakeholders to negotiate. So on that note, Arvind Saab, back to you. And hopefully we have some time for questions.
Yes, of course. Thank you so much, Professor Soman. We do have a couple of questions already which have come up. Let me start off with the second question that Rajiv Vaidyanathan is asking. How many behavioral science concepts are relatively universal that can be used as plug and play interventions in a wide variety of situations of and how many require situation specific modifications to be effectively used? A fear underlying this question is that someone reads nudge or thinking fast and slow and becomes a behavioral science expert designing real world interventions that may be context sensitive. Let me add a particular example that came to my mind actually as I was listening to your talk. So in certain countries, for example, you talked about organ donations as a default option in certain countries. The potentially dark side of it is that if that is there, then some people get bumped off in creative ways to be able to harvest the organs, and under certain circumstances that might that kind of a default option might encourage an undesirable behavior. So just to kind of add to that question or supplement that question.
Yeah, so let me respond to these two things separately. So first, to Rajiv's point, I'm going to be a little bit controversial and say, I don't think there's a single intervention that reliably translates to every context, right? Everything has some element of context dependence to it. Taylor wrote a book called Misbehaving, and in that book, he introduced a term called SIF, supposedly irrelevant factor. Things that we don't think should affect the outcome, but they do. And I think we have SIFs for every single thing. So let me pick on perhaps the most robust finding in our literature, the one that has been replicated numerous times, this notion of framing as a loss or a gain. Right? So we talked about the pricing examples. Changes in prices can be either signaled as a loss or a gain. I know a store in which almost like 100% of the items are always on sale. Why? Because the owner tells me that it is easier for me to reduce a discount than it is to increase the price. Okay, so it's a common tactic, and we've seen this play out in many places. Now, it turns out that most of our experiments on showing the gain versus loss asymmetry are done in the context of a particular brand independently, but not in a competitive context. Right? So what happens is, if you're in a competition where every other brand is doing the same thing, then it turns out that it's not optimal for you to also frame your price as a reduced loss, right? Why? Because now a new factor, novelty, becomes relevant, right? So context does all kinds of things. It changes the way in which you interpret information. It changes the salience of certain attributes. It changes people's attention to certain attributes. And so I would go so far as to say that we should never do a plug and play. And Rajiv's fear is right. And in fact, the book that's coming out, Behavioral Science in the Wild, actually gets to this point. So the book is entirely about this point, that plug and play is a dangerous thing, because every single finding of ours is context dependent. What's the solution? Well, we have to develop a culture of rapid testing, just like we've done for COVID, with interventions, right? So, I think published work is a good starting point to develop hypotheses, which we can say, okay, let me see if this works in India. Let me see if this works with low-income consumers. Let me see it. Do a quick test, and only then deploy the intervention. So Rajiv's point is really well taken. I think it's an important, it is a big danger. On the organ donation, I think there's a couple of pieces to think about. So obviously the negative behaviors you spoke about are a concern in many parts of the world, but the bigger concern is that this whole switch in from opt-in to opt-out doesn't work. And it doesn't work because you do get a lot more presumed consent in an opt-out regime. But there is another step, which is that in most countries, after the person is deceased, their family has to consent to the organ harvesting. And what we are learning in some of our work here in Ontario is that if people actively register to become organ donors, they are much more likely to express their wishes to their family. So only 20% people are registered organ donors, but most of those 20% actually end up being donors. In Germany or Switzerland, or some parts of the world where it's the other way around, you get 95% presumed consent because people fail to opt out, but these people never speak to the family. So when it actually comes time to harvest the organs, the family declines. So I think that's the other nuance to it.
Interesting. We have a couple of other comments and observations, but I'm just debating with myself whether or not to. Let me paraphrase it a little and ask you.
Fair enough.
So there is a very fundamental question, actually. The difference between an optimal decision and a rational decision, especially from a behavioral science perspective.
So it's a great question. I have multiple ways in which I can think about it. So the first thing is, I think there can be a lot of debate on what an optimal decision is. So for example, how much should I save for retirement? Right? Is you and I could diverge in our understanding of what savings rate we should have to help us accomplish our savings goal. But I think you and I will both agree that 0% is not good. Okay. So oftentimes there are easy win situations in the world where we know that, ideally, maybe we don't want everybody to see the doctor every year. But we definitely want more than 17% of people to be getting an annual checkup, right? So I think part of it is behavioral science should play in areas where there is a clear problem, right? And you're right. Sometimes the optimality changes. Now, think about other decisions. Think about a decision about, for example, in Canada, we have a pension plan where you can start claiming benefits at age 62 all the way up to age 70. Obviously, the longer you wait, the bigger your paycheck, right? At what age should I claim the benefit? This is not a problem for choice architecture to solve. Choice architecture is great when you want everybody to do the same thing, right? Here it's different. If I have two uncles, I'm using language from Eric Johnson's recent book. One uncle comes from a family where all the men live up to age 100, right? It makes more sense for that uncle to wait till age 70 because his corpus is going to be larger. The other uncle comes from a family where most men die young. Perhaps for that uncle, it makes sense to start claiming early. Right? So I do think that oftentimes, when we simplify our contribution to the world, we have this claim about this is a universally rational thing to do. It's often not. There's a lot of heterogeneity, and I think we need to respect that. One last thing that I will say is a lot of these popular books like Thinking Fast and Slow and Nudge have been popularized as saying that consumers are irrational in a stupid sort of sense. I actually don't think that's true. I mean, people are people, right? I think it is more irrational for us as managers and academics to think that our consumers will be rational. To me, that's the bigger flaw. So in Last Mile, I talk about the fact that I think that's a bigger form of irrationality than anything else. We need to respect the fact that they're human.
How interesting. We should chat further on that one, Dilip. The last one is kind of a statement, yeah, there is a lot of published literature, Mr. J.K. Sharma, Dr. Sharma. So I'm going to skip that one. Do write to us, write to me directly, and I'm happy to share some citations that you could pursue at your own leisure.